I'm Tommy, and today we'll be talking about how to make spooky chords. Chords and intervals are the foundation of harmony, and what gives harmony a spooky quality is dissonance, or when two notes are too close together and you get a very uneasy feeling. Some scales just naturally sound spookier. The harmonic minor, the Hungarian, and the diminished scales are great examples of this. And the reason that they sound spookier is that their notes are arranged in such a way that dissonance is much more common to run into. Something cool that I learned from researching for this video is that the beat frequency, or that pulsing sound that you hear when two highly dissonant sounds are played together, can be calculated using this. And I also learned that very talented piano tuners can use it to tune pianos by ear. Dissonance and beat pulses are also a compositional tool to some composers, such as Phil Nyblock, Alvin Lucier, and Jacinto Scelsi's Zenoibus. And this is an especially admirable and difficult task, because beat frequencies represent an audible, one-dimensional version of a frequent type of visual distortion called the Moiré effect, which you can see right now if you were to take your phone, tilt it, and then take a photo of a screen. If you go about 4 minutes and 50 seconds into Jacinto Scelsi's Zenoibus, you're going to hear the same interval that's used in the introduction of 3 Days Grace's Someone Who Cares. So, beat frequencies and dissonance aren't completely out of use, and they're not only for niche compositions. They do find their way into more popular music from time to time. A good way to measure the dissonance of an interval is to fractionally analyze it. You can take the frequency of the highest note over the frequency of the lowest note and then see how far you can simplify that. If you can get it down to 3/2, that creates a fifth. 5/4 creates a major third, 10/9 creates a minor third, and 9/8 creates a diminished fifth. The most important thing to keep in mind when performing fractional analyses is that the further you can simplify the interval, the calmer and more happy sounding it will come out. If you notice that the diminished fifth and the minor third are both slightly higher numbers for the numerator and the denominator than something like a major third or a fifth, you'll notice that the higher the numbers are, the more dissonant it will be. Since chords are just two or more intervals put together, you can certainly look at a chord as an ecosystem of intervals, where each one has an effect on how the other one comes out. And that leads into a very important note here, which is that the further away two notes are, the less important their interval is because it won't be as apparent. One of the staple tools of creating spooky harmonies is chromaticism. Chromaticism is straying from the notes that have been prescribed to you by your scale and pulling in any other notes that you want. And typically it's good to follow a pattern with these, but you don't always have to. Sometimes just wildly altering extensions of chords can lead to a very spooky vibe. Sometimes chromaticism comes out scary, but sometimes it comes out jazzy and inquisitive. And a very good example of this would be John Coltrane's tritone substitutions, which later evolved into his famous Coltrane changes. If you want to hear those, my intro is nothing but Coltrane changes, but I'll also play a sample of them for you here. Now we'll be covering a handful of spooky chords to help you build spooky chord progressions. And one of my favorites is the major minor seventh, which is a root, major third, fifth, and minor seventh. And where it's best used, in my opinion, is alternating with the traditionally structured minor seventh. And you can see here that the major seventh is the chord on the left, and the traditionally structured minor seventh is the chord on the right. The only difference is that the major minor seventh has a major third instead of a minor third, and that half-step movement from one to the other is fantastic for building tension. The next chord that we're going to be talking about is the diminished chord, but the extensions are where it really gets spooky. So here's a diminished triad. Here it is with its seventh, which note is a major seventh. You're adding a B here, not an A sharp, if you're making this with the root at C. And then if you add in a ninth, which yet again is built the same exact way that you would build it if you were adding a major ninth, the tension is incredibly high. And so I feel that this is best used in progressions just before resolving a very, very dramatic tension that you have built. Another chord that's worthy of being in your spooky harmony toolbox is the Augmented. And on its own, the triad sounds like this. It's a major triad where the fifth is sharp, and this really begins to shine when you construct it as a seventh or a ninth. Here it is as a seventh, and then as a ninth. And there's a really interesting reaction if you were to build this with a minor third instead of a major, because then your minor third is a D sharp and your ninth is a D natural. And so there's a lot of dissonance created there, but it's not as in your face as it could be because they are separated by an octave. Another interesting alteration that you can do to chord extensions to get a very spooky sound is to flatten a ninth. So if you were to build this in C, the ninth would traditionally be D, but since we're flattening it, we're going to be putting it on C sharp. And it sounds like this. And it's much better to keep that ninth distanced up an octave, but if you're playing this live on keys, you may be tempted to drop that down to be just beside the root, in which case it's going to sound like this. This is an instance where how you voice your chords is going to dramatically affect the color of them. Another useful chord for creating spooky music that isn't too spooky, so perhaps this would be really useful for building tension and giving more of a sense of foreshadowing to your music, is a traditionally built major ninth with an augmented fifth. So if we were to create that in C, instead of having a G as your fifth, it would be a G sharp, and it sounds like this. While researching for this video, I kept encountering tritones. I kept encountering people talking about them and using them in compositions. And a tritone is an interval that essentially splits an octave in half. For example, when rooted in C, it would be F sharp, and it sounds like this. And I didn't expect a lot of things that I would encounter about it. For example, there are so many vocabulary words associated with tritones that are not associated with other intervals that it blows me away. Tritonia and atritonia being the quality of having or not having a tritone, and then tritonic or atritonic, which is essentially the same word but just as an adjective. And also the reason that the C major ninth with the diminished third and fifth was such a spooky chord is that it contains a tritone, by dropping its fifth down from a G to an F sharp. Now for some more fun tritone facts, which is a phrase that I never thought that I would say or hear in my entire life. Historically, tritones were referred to as the devil in music. They were genuinely hated that much. And also, if you're thinking that tritones are some exotic interval, they're really not. They exist in the major scale between the fourth and seventh step, and they exist in the natural minor between the second and the sixth. To throw it back to those vocab words, what that means is that the major and minor scales are tritonic. And there's another really interesting scientific point that I learned when reading about this. There is something called the Tritone Paradox, which is when people are shown a shepherd tone, which is a pitch that sounds like it's continuously rising even though it's not. It's just an auditory illusion. When the interval that they're shown is a tritone, some people hear it moving up, some people hear it moving down, and there doesn't seem to be any way to predict whether people are going to say that it's going up or down. I'll link to a study about this in the description. While reading for this video, something that I kept encountering that I wasn't aware of in the past was the difference between enharmonic and inharmonic. And if you also hear those as the same, you're likely experiencing this. Making scary chord progressions is more about how you build tension than how you resolve it, although it is still very important to avoid a traditionally happy resolve. One of the most important things that you can do is to keep in mind that most chord progressions aren't going to be exceeding 4 to 8 chords. And if you view each chord as a word or two that you can say to communicate your message, that's not a lot, so every chord really has to count. Often the first 1 or 2 will form exposition, the next will build tension, and that will go up until the last chord or 2, where you're using that to resolve it in some way, oftentimes in a very dissatisfactory manner. Ending subtonically or supertonically, which means below or above the tonic or the root of your scale, is something that I tend to default to when making spooky progressions, but It's definitely not your only move. You can still pull back to the tonic with something chromatic thrown in, which means a note that is not prescribed to you by your scale, or you can still take other moves to end up with a spooky chord progression. There are countless ways to get there, and it's up to you to find how you specifically want to do it. I hope that this video has been helpful for you making spooky music. Feel free to leave any questions that you have in the comments, and have a happy Halloween.